It's a simple fact that China is now the world's fastest growing major economy. Year on year, its trade surplus has more than doubled to over 31,000 million US dollars. Its overall exports have exceeded $200,000 million for the first time. China is also importing more than it has ever done in the history of that great nation.
It is in this context that the Chinese president proposed a new Asian organization for cooperation on security, crime, energy, terrorism and disaster relief. He invited Iran and Russia to this alliance, but not America. Indeed, he warned the United States not to respond with a military build-up, saying, "To beef up military alliances targeted at a third party is not conducive to maintaining common security in the region."
And that's not an end to America's worries. While still the world's largest economy, the International Monetary Fund says that China is in fact surpassing the States on a key economic indicator. So how do the American public feel about China's growing influence and status? What can the United States do to protect its own international status? And who's going to be number one in 10 years' time? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. And we began by asking the American public for their feelings on why China is growing so much more quickly than the United States. Here's what they said.
China is a much bigger country. The government, the way they're set up, it's a communism. So the rates that people work at is much lower because they're trying to make sure that, the wealth is spread evenly. And in general, they have so many people. There's so many jobs, so many countries here, they go overseas, they create so many jobs. It's so easy to just keep the rates that they have to pay their employees much lower than they would, here.
Economically, well, they have larger labor pool, cheaper labor as well. I believe they have access to a lot of resources that could be used.
I think they're putting a lot of their resources into growing their economy, possibly more than the U.S.
Well, I think that it starts at a young age, and I think that their school systems kind of bring them up to be, work hard, and I think that it's just a different environment there, and that's probably why at a young age it starts like that.
Economically, because they have, a centralized power kind of organizing things, they can produce things a lot more cheaply and a lot more quickly because they don't quite have the human rights and, regulations that our government does.
China has a much larger population, and their population has much more room to grow compared to the U.S.
I think it's kind of due to the amount of resources they have. They do have a lot of important metals that we kind of need for high technology, and also I think they emphasize more on math and science than we do maybe. I'm not that learned in the subject, but that's what I feel.
Cheap labor cost, better education system, better technology.
Not surprisingly, no one single settled view from the American public. We put the same question to our experts.
There are a number of factors insofar as China's growth is concerned. Firstly, China has been growing its GDP in almost double-digit figures over the last 10 years. It's only this year and perhaps last year that it has been below 10%. So it's been an economic engine for the last 30 odd years. Secondly, what used to be known as sort of the demographic problem, i.e. having a large population, has actually become a dividend for China. Over 1 billion people, huge domestic market, and they don't necessarily need to export, although in the past they did rely tremendously on the US consumer for the growth, but they're now sort of focusing very much on internal consumption as well, plus the periphery countries in Southeast Asia and Africa. So certainly the economic model has been very, very interesting and has really provided the growth that we are seeing in China, and it will continue, as far as I can see, for a long time. And America has a huge challenge with China at this moment.
There's a really straightforward economic explanation for China's much faster growth rate than the US. And that is essentially that China is a much more open economy, much more connected to the rest of the world through trade, and it has far higher levels of investment than the US, and it has done for a very prolonged period. And those two key fundamental factors explain why the US hasn't been able to grow as fast as China and why it won't be able to grow as fast as China for as far as the eye can see.
So how do Americans feel about the increasing importance of China on the world stage, both politically and economically? And what does this mean for America and its role on the world stage? Here's what we found out.
It makes them a larger player. They have a lot more influence over other countries. And what does this mean for the U.S.? Well, they're going to have to give up some of their influence because now China's an economic powerhouse.
I mean, they're taking over the entire globe, you know. With the way they're doing everything, everything's being done in China. America is a superpower when it comes to military and stuff, but when it comes to, you know, economy and how things are made, where things are made, and job, China's taking over.
I think America will still be a dominant country, though I think having more people come to the table is important, and I think we do depend on China.
It means that America no longer can do everything it says and wants to do just because of its economic might. So America is probably going to have to clean up its act somewhat.
I think personally it's great to have more countries that are like up and coming and everything, but I can see how America would be intimidated by it because we've always been as a country on top and number one. And I know as far as education goes, like we have been struggling a lot lately. So having another country that is also economically challenging us would be very intimidating as a country.
Well, we're borrowing a lot of money from China, so we kind of have to be partners in it. But also, they are military-wise, I'd rather have them on our side than on the other side.
It's definitely going to be a challenge for the U.S. to assert itself in the way that it has before. Economically, I think that the U.S. is definitely going to have to find some way to compete with China if it's going to maintain its spot in the world. So.
Well, I think it's good because it gives it makes the world have more perspectives on issues instead of being dominated by one country. It means America's voice will be less important comparatively, but I mean, we'll still have a lot of power, so it'll still be pretty important.
So Americans aren't panicking, but there are hints of concern. We asked our experts for an objective viewpoint.
China is, as you well know, is part of the the BRIC countries, which recently, earlier this year, a few months ago, had a meeting in Brazil where they've decided to set up a sort of challenge to the World Bank and the IMF by starting a new bank in Shanghai, which will do similar sort of activities as the World Bank. So that's one aspect of it. Secondly is China also is part of the Shanghai Cooperation Council, which includes countries like Russia, India, Pakistan, the previous Southern Russian Republic. So it's a big sort of bloc, which is perhaps half the world population, which is part of the Shanghai Cooperation Council. So that's a second grouping that China is part of. Thirdly, economically, China has been growing tremendously, plus the job losses that America is facing because jobs are moving to China, manufacturing jobs. You see companies like Dell Computers, Microsoft, Google, most of the IT companies, hardware companies have based their locations in China because at the end of the day, cost of production is much lower, and America has had a loss of employment due to jobs moving to China. So at many levels, China is proving to be quite challenging, both at an economic level, plus politically and geopolitically because of its membership of different organizations, as I said. So it's something that I think the American politicians and the Washington consensus can't ignore, that China is a major player. It's not just a regional player, but it's an international player which is really there to challenge the American hegemony all over the world.
Well, there's two key things, and I think quite important to separate them, which is the reality versus the propaganda in the Western countries. The reality is that China is a huge boost to the world. I mean, China will add more in terms of actual dollars of growth to the world economy this year than the US, as it has done for very many years now. and will do in the future. So that's a boost to the world. That's the reality. The propaganda is that this is all a threat, but that's to turn the world on its head. That's the idea that if someone else is getting richer, you're getting poorer. The reality is we all benefit from this, when we should be discussing really how we all benefit from this.
Recently, the International Monetary Fund announced that China has surpassed the US on a key economic indicator called purchasing power parity. Is this a challenge to America, and can the US cope? Is what the public thought.
I feel like this would be a challenge for sure, because a lot of people aren't really that confident in the U.S. economy still, because I remember growing up during the recession and stuff, there was a lot of panic. So I feel like the U.S. still needs to gain back the consumer's confidence.
I wasn't aware of that. So is this a threat to the U.S.? Not particularly. I don't feel so.
It's not a real challenge for the U.S. right now, because in terms of purchasing power for each individual, the United States is still much higher, but it shows that China is making progress, and eventually it may be able to take over the United States in terms of the true economic power of the country.
I mean, I guess insofar as we want to be number one with everything, I don't know. Is it a challenge? Has there a general decline in American economic strength? Perhaps. Should this be the impetus behind reevaluating certain economic policies? Maybe, but I don't know if it's a challenge necessarily.
Honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sorry.
Well, we cannot never cope because we don't manufacture anything anymore. So we have to have something to sell, to buy.
It is a challenge for the U.S., but with the U.S. being in the lead technologically, and China, a lot of times what they're doing is using other technologies and building upon it. The U.S. can gain back the lead if it just continues to be innovative and doing what it's been doing since its founding.
It is definitely a challenge. It's a huge threat, and I don't know if with the way the system is set up right now in China and the way it's set up here, it's going to be a tough battle for the U.S. to win. They definitely shouldn't give up. They should fight for it. As you know, this is the United States. The people here, this should be the priority, to create jobs here in this country to boost our own economy. But it's definitely going to be a tough challenge, as China has more resources, they have more connections, more power in that portion.
One would expect the American people to take a generally positive view. Our experts now provide a perspective on the true challenge which China presents to the USA.
Well, can the US cope? That's a million-dollar question. Because what's happening, as you know, that America is spending a lot more money on armaments, is fighting wars in different locations, whether it's in Iraq or bombing Syria, and it has bases in over 100 locations. So all this costs money. So at the end of the day, China also has, obviously, it has the largest army, foot soldiers, so to speak, compared to any other nation, but it's not spending as much money on armament, on sort of military build-up, which is in a way a waste of resources. So that's one aspect why America has to be concerned where China is going, because their resources are being utilized to uplift the country. I mean, an interesting thing about China is that they're building almost 100 mega cities, which are going to come on the scene in the next perhaps 5 years. If they decide to do something, they go very rapidly. Most of the analysts and the economists say that probably China may surpass even the USA and Europe insofar as electric cars are concerned in the next 5 years, because pollution is quite high in cities like Peking and Shanghai, air pollution. So for that reason, China is developing far more rapidly in eco-friendly cars as well. So there are a whole host of things that are happening in China which are proving to be a challenge both at an economic level, political level and military level.
Well, the IMF is quite right that China is or has just surpassed the US in terms of size of its economy in purchasing power parity terms. That's quite right. It is a big challenge to the US. That doesn't happen very often. the last time the leadership of the world economy changed was at the end of the 19th century. But there's nothing the US can do about that now, that China is set to race ahead of the US economy over the next several years and probably decades. So the real question is, what can the US and everyone else do to maximise the benefits they get from that?
What is America's best course of action to restore public confidence in the light of China's growing presence on the global stage? Who better to tell us than the public themselves?
Our greatest influence in the entire world is that we are the largest commercial market in the entire world, and that includes China. But in the last 30 years, the purchasing power of our middle class, the wealth of the middle class has fallen from 60% down to under 40%, and that purchasing power is translated to other sectors of the society that don't use it for purchasing power, so therefore do not use it to stimulate the economy. I think our biggest response would be to restore the middle class.
It's a good question. I guess to not be scared to reevaluate some of the policies that have been implemented in the past that maybe have led to a position in which we aren't the strong economic power we always had assumed ourselves to be, and to create an open dialogue. I think it's becoming more and more of a globalized world. There's less of these east-west divides, I think, especially in business. And the kind of proactive thing is to acknowledge that and not live in this worldview of, the mansion on the hill.
I don't know. I feel like there's been a lot of issues with the military in the Middle East and stuff like that. So if the government can get control of their spending and get their spending at levels that the consumer is confident with, then the consumer will have more confidence putting their money into the government and spending it.
I definitely think it's a challenge to the United States in terms for coping. Yeah, I think we have to make some changes. I personally don't know what they are, but I'm sure the people who know these things do. But yes, I think we can. We are a strong country, and we can economically assert ourselves.
I think the U.S. Just dealing with a lot of internal issues and its own citizens' unhappiness and issues that they find important would immensely help the U.S. get back together internally, and therefore will give the U.S. a better capability of focusing on external affairs.
Well, we need to create, for instance, right now, the electric cars. China's now doing it where they're going to have 400 miles per charge. Tesla already came out with it. We know we can. The three big companies can make that. They just don't want to because we're stuck with the oil in Middle East.
America has various options on how to cope with China's growth. What's it likely to do? Our experts said this.
Well, the US has a problem in regards to how it portrays China. That's the real issue. It portrays China as a threat. Not the first time it's done that with any country. It used to portray Japan as a threat, and before that it used to portray West Germany as a threat. So I think we should be clear that this is a wrong framework for addressing growth. It really should be about how we mutually benefit and cooperate. If you regard anyone else's growth as a threat, as a problem, that tends to lead you in the direction of, rather than increasing your own growth, trying to diminish theirs, which is what the US has done in the past.
In 10 years' time, which country will be the world's biggest superpower? We posed that question to the American public.
It's still the U.S. unless we go through some major depression and everything falls. But yeah, still the U.S.
Politically, U.S. is always going to be on top. Military-wise, we're big. We have a lot of power in a lot of places in the world. We can, if we want to sanction somewhere, all we got to do is, move our finger, do this, and it's done. Economically, China is still going to be challenging. They're going to be right up there with us. They're growing faster than we are.
Politically, I think the United States of America would still be in a very strong position given 10 years down the road, even if China has a great developing economy.
Probably the United States, but it'll be very, very close.
Probably the U.S. still, if we
still have categories of superpowers as we conceive of them now.
Hopefully it'll still be the U.S., but I feel like we've been struggling a lot lately, and just the voters' confidence has been going down and down and down with each election from what I've read about history. But hopefully I feel like we can still pick it back up because we haven't dipped that far.
So much could change in 10 years. I'm not entirely sure, but probably the U.S., I think.
It will be India, besides China. Those two will get together because they have almost 3 billion people put together. That's half the population. So if they do it right, they should have the most out of everybody. We're 4th or 5th now. We're going to be like 10th if we don't start creating any new products or any kind of stuff.
Probably China.
I'll go with the United States, unfortunately.
I'm a little bit biased on this, but I would say India, just because I know a little bit about the country since I am Indian, and they are growing at a very rapid rate without a lot of these issues that China and both the U.S. face.
Oh, China. Yeah. I personally think our government is extremely slow and terrible. I think the two-party system makes it so it can't really accomplish much in a short amount of time, and I think while I may disagree with China's government system, it's definitely efficient in what it's doing. So I definitely think they're going to grow at a faster rate than we can unless we make some drastic changes.
Pretty sure it'll still be the U.S.
Well, since I live here, I want to say the U.S., so I don't know, I'm highly biased.
It's possible to make predictions based on the facts. We invited our experts to speculate on which country will be number one in 10 years' time.
The reality is that most of the commentators, economists and analysts are very clear that China, as I said, because of the population dividend that they have, because of the inroads they are making in Africa and South America, the relationships that they have in multi-national organizations, plus, Chinese are very much investing globally. So I see in the next 10 years, without any doubt, plus also the relationship that's developing between China and Russia will also put China in a very strong position. And I think in the next 10 years, I see China perhaps being a premier, a leading country on the sort of global scene.
Well, over the next 10 years, it's quite clear that the Chinese economy will significantly surpass the US economy in terms of size, at least in PPP terms. In effect, if one country grows 5% faster than another, in about 14 or 15 years, then they're double the size. So you'll see what happens over 10 years. We'll be heading in that direction. And therefore, that will change lots of things politically on the world stage. And it's a question of how people adapt to that. The change is not unstoppable. If people take the view that this is a threat, then that could lead to all sorts of difficulties. But if people take the view that this is primarily an opportunity, that a very significant proportion of the world's population is lifting itself out of poverty, and all the increased opportunities that offers for global trade, creation of jobs in Western economies, etc., then there's a real possibility of stronger growth arising in the Western economies as a result. And boy, do we need it.
As the United States stagnates, held back by a combination of internal social and domestic pressures, China thrusts ahead with a seemingly unstoppable and well-managed economic strategy. The message seems clear. In 10 years or so, America looks set to lose its status as the globe's top superpower. The balance of influence is drifting east, and it seems that Washington is powerless to prevent it.